Eliza Crane was 18 and homeless in the dust-choked streets of Halsey, Kansas. She had no family left in the world, no prospects to speak of, and a carefully folded $10 bill that represented the last of her mother's meager savings. With that solitary bill, she bought the abandoned Cattleman's Trust building, a gutted stone shell on a main street that had already surrendered to the prairie wind. But what no one knew, not the bitter, ruined ranchers who rode past her without a glance, not the prairie dogs that had claimed the town square, and not even Eliza herself, was that behind a massive, rust-fused vault door lay the secret to the town's ruin, and the unlikely blueprint for her own salvation. This is the story of how a book, a ledger, and the ability to read them rebuilt a life from the ashes of a forgotten town. Her mother, Eleanor Crane, had been a schoolteacher, a woman from a quiet corner of Ohio who believed that knowledge was the only inheritance that could never be stolen. She had followed a husband west, a freighter with hopeful eyes who was lost to a blizzard on the Santa Fe Trail when Eliza was only 4. Eleanor never remarried. Instead, she poured all her thwarted hopes and quiet affections into her daughter and her small one-room schoolhouse. She taught Eliza the steady, beautiful logic of numbers, the shapes of letters, and the stories they could build. While other girls learned stitching and canning, Eliza learned the quiet satisfaction of a balanced equation and the clean lines of a well-formed sentence. Her most treasured possession, the object she carried with her through every hardship, was her mother's own copy of Euclid's Elements, its cover worn smooth, its pages filled with Eleanor's precise, delicate notes in the margins. It was a book of geometry, of proofs and axioms, and her mother had called it the grammar of the physical world. Eleanor believed that if you could understand the principles that governed lines and angles, you could understand the structure of anything, from the joists of a roof to the columns of a ledger. That inheritance became Eliza's only shield when her mother's cough deepened and settled in her lungs. Consumption was a slow, patient thief, and it took Eleanor over the course of a long, hard winter. Eliza was 16 when she buried her mother in the small churchyard, and from that day forward, she was entirely on her own. She was competent and quiet, accustomed to work, and she found small jobs here and there, mending clothes for the blacksmith's wife, scrubbing floors at the mercantile, helping with the canning at the Miller Ranch. She never complained, never asked for more than was offered, and held herself with a stillness that people mistook for simplicity. They saw a plain, hard-working orphan. They did not see the sharp, observant mind behind her calm, gray eyes, a mind that saw the world in terms of structure, of causes and effects, of problems waiting for a logical solution. She was always watching, always learning, filing away the details of how things worked, or more often in Halsey, how they were falling apart. The town itself was in a slow, grinding decline, a casualty of a cattle boom that had gone bust, and the final fatal blow had come from the very institution that was meant to be its anchor, the Cattleman's Trust. The bank's failure had been swift and brutal. Its president, a man named Silas Croft with a warm smile and cold eyes, had vanished overnight. One morning, the doors were locked. By noon, the panic had set in. By evening, the town understood it had been bled dry. The ranchers, the merchants, the widows who had entrusted their small savings to Croft's care, they were all ruined. The locked doors of the bank were a monument to their broken trust, and Halsey began to empty out, family by family, as if a plague had swept through. People packed what they could onto their wagons and simply left, abandoning homes and businesses, surrendering their dreams to the encroaching prairie grass. Eliza's own ejection was not a single dramatic event, but the final quiet consequence of this communal collapse. The Millers, the last family she worked for, called her into their sparsely furnished parlor one afternoon. Mrs. Miller, a woman who had always been kind in her own distracted way, could not meet her eyes. It was Mr. Miller who spoke, his voice heavy with the weariness of a man who had lost everything. They were leaving, heading for Oregon where they had family. They had no money to pay her, and no room for her on the wagon. He pressed $2 into her hand. "It's all we can spare, Eliza," he said, his voice rough with shame. "God go with you." She did not cry or plead. She simply nodded, thanked them for their past kindness, and went to the small attic room where she slept. She gathered her few possessions: a spare dress, her mother's worn book, a tin cup, a blanket, and the small cloth purse that held her savings. She now had $10.12 to her name. She walked out of the Miller house and did not look back. The town of Halsey, which had been her whole world, had finally and completely cast her out. She was adrift in a sea of abandoned buildings and broken dreams. She spent that first night huddled in the covered doorway of the old mercantile, the rough wool of her blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, the hard spine of her mother's book a solid, comforting weight against her side. The wind, a constant, lonely presence on the plains, moaned through the empty streets, carrying with it the scent of dust and decay. She felt a profound and chilling solitude, the kind that settles deep in the bones, but despair was a luxury she could not afford. As the sun rose, casting long, skeletal shadows down the main street, she got to her feet. Her mind, trained in the cool logic of her mother's lessons, was already at work, not on what she had lost, but on the problem that lay before her: survival. Her journey was not one of miles, but of steps, a slow, deliberate circuit of the dead town. She walked the length of Main Street, her eyes taking in the details of the decay with a dispassionate clarity. She saw the sun-bleached curtains still hanging in the windows of the hotel, the faded lettering on the assayer's office, the way a single, resilient sunflower had pushed its way up through a crack in the boardwalk. She was not looking for pity or for remnants of the past. She was assessing resources, searching for shelter. Most of the wooden buildings were collapsing, their roofs caved in, their walls leaning at precarious angles. They were fire traps, filled with rotting wood and broken glass, offering no real defense against the elements or the occasional drifter who might wander through. But the bank was different. It was the only stone building in town, a two-story structure of limestone blocks, quarried from the hills to the north. It had been built to project an image of permanence and security, an irony that was almost too bitter to contemplate. Its grand windows were shattered, and the heavy oak doors hung slightly ajar, but the walls were solid, square, and true. A notice, weathered and peeling, had been nailed to one of the doors by the county marshal months ago. It read, "For sale by county order, property of the defunct Cattlemen's Trust, $10 for deed and title. County assumes no liability." $10. It was everything she had, save for 12 cents. To anyone else it was an absurd proposition, paying for a ruin, a monument to failure that was worth less than nothing. But Eliza saw it differently. She saw 4 solid walls and the possibility of a roof over her head. She saw a defensible space, a shelter that would not collapse in the first winter storm. It was a problem, yes, but a problem with a structure she could understand. The decision formed in her mind with the quiet certainty of a solved equation. She spent the next 2 days walking the 20 miles to the county seat in Prairie Ridge. The marshal, a tired, overweight man named Blevins with faded suspenders and a permanent look of resignation, was sitting behind a desk cluttered with dusty papers. He looked up, surprised, when she stated her business. "The old bank in Halsey?" he asked, squinting as if to see her better. "Child, what in God's name would you want with that pile of rocks?" She did not offer an explanation. She simply placed her $10 bill on the desk. "I want to buy it," she said. He shrugged, the gesture of a man long past caring about the strange tides of human misfortune. He filled out the deed with a scratchy pen, signed it, and stamped it with the county seal. He pushed the paper across the desk. "It's yours," he said. And then, with a flicker of something that might have been pity, he added, "Good luck to you." Eliza folded the deed carefully and placed it in her bodice. It was the first thing she had ever truly owned. The walk back to Halsey felt different. The wind was still cold, the landscape just as vast and empty, but she was not a vagrant anymore. She was a property owner. She was walking home. Upon her return, she approached the Cattleman's Trust, not as a squatter seeking refuge, but as its legal proprietor, the deed a crisp, official document tucked safely away. She pushed the heavy oak doors fully open, the groan of their hinges echoing in the cavernous space, and stepped inside to take stock of her purchase. The air was thick with the smell of damp plaster, stale air, and the faint, dry scent of old paper. Sunlight streamed through the shattered front windows, illuminating swirling columns of dust and casting a harsh light on the scene of devastation. The main banking floor was a wide, open room with a high ceiling, but it was buried under a layer of debris. Plaster had fallen in great chunks from the ceiling, mingling with shards of glass, splintered wood from overturned furniture, and a thick carpet of miscellaneous papers, old forms, notices, and scraps of correspondence that had been scattered in the bank's final, frantic days. The once proud teller's counter, a long, imposing barrier of carved oak, had been vandalized, its surface scarred and a section of its beautiful grillwork torn away, likely by looters searching for anything of value. Her gaze traveled upward. The roof, she noted with a practical eye, was the most immediate problem. In the rear corner of the building, a section of the timber and shingles had given way, leaving a ragged hole several feet across, open to the sky. Water stains radiated out from the hole, dark and sprawling across the remaining ceiling joists and down the stone wall. That was where the rain and snow would come in, turning the interior into a swamp and rotting what little wood was left. The rest of the structure, however, was as solid as she had hoped. The limestone walls were immense, 2 feet thick, the blocks fitted together with a craftsman's care. They were stained and grimy, but they were unbreached, a fortress against the relentless prairie wind. She walked the perimeter of the room, her boots crunching on the debris. In the back, behind the ruined teller counter, were 2 small offices. One was completely empty, save for a broken chair. The other, the bank president's office, was in better condition, its door still on its hinges. Inside, a heavy mahogany desk lay on its side, its drawers pulled out and emptied. And against the back wall of this office stood the vault. It was a formidable object, a black iron rectangle set flush into the stone. The door was massive, at least 6 inches thick, its face a mottled canvas of orange and brown rust. A large, spoked handle, meant to retract the locking bolts, was frozen in place. The combination dial above it was a solid, unmoving lump of corroded metal. Someone, likely the same looters who had vandalized the counter, had tried to force it. Deep gouges scarred the iron around the seam of the door, and a heavy sledgehammer, its handle cracked, lay on the floor beside it, a testament to their failed efforts. Eliza ran her hand over the cold, rough surface. She felt no thrill of mystery, no dream of hidden gold. The bank had been picked clean. Everyone knew that. The vault was just another broken part of her broken building, a sealed-off chamber of forgotten air. Her focus remained on the immediate, the practical. Before she could think about vaults or ledgers, she needed a dry place to sleep, a fire to ward off the chill of the coming autumn nights, and a way to secure her new home against the elements. The task before her was immense, but for the first time in a long time, she had a place to begin. She had work to do. The first days were spent clearing a space. She found a rusty but serviceable shovel in the alley behind the building and began the slow, back-breaking work of hauling out the debris. She worked with a steady, unhurried rhythm, her movements economical and precise. She piled the broken wood in one corner for eventual use as firewood, the shattered glass in another for safe disposal, and shoveled the plaster dust and rubble into a discarded wooden crate, which she dragged outside and emptied load by load. She focused on the back corner of the main room, the area furthest from the hole in the roof. By the end of the third day, she had cleared a 10 by 10-foot square of the stone floor. She swept it clean with a makeshift broom fashioned from prairie grass tied to a stick. This small, clean square, set against the backdrop of chaos, was her first victory. It was her kitchen, her bedroom, her parlor. It was home. Her next task was the roof. She couldn't hope to rebuild it properly, not without lumber or tools she didn't possess, but she could patch it. She spent a day scavenging the other abandoned buildings in Halsey, carefully prying loose intact boards from collapsed walls and collecting sheets of rusted tin from the roof of the old livery stable. Using a length of rope and her own surprising strength, she hauled the materials to the second floor and, working cautiously on the weakened roof joists, she fashioned a crude but effective patch over the hole, layering the boards and tin to shed the worst of the rain. Her greatest find came from the alley behind the blacksmith's shop, a small, pot-bellied iron stove cast aside because of a long crack in its firebox. She dragged the heavy object back to her cleared corner in the bank and set about repairing it. This was work that required patience and ingenuity, qualities her mother had nurtured in her. She remembered watching the blacksmith repair his forge with a special kind of clay. She found a deposit of similar clay down by the dry creek bed, mixed it with water to make a thick paste, and painstakingly filled the crack in the stove, smoothing it with her fingers. She reinforced the repair with wire she salvaged from a broken fence. After letting the clay dry for 2 days, she built a small, tentative fire inside. The clay held. The stove drew beautifully, its gentle heat pushing back the damp chill of the stone building. That night, for the first time in months, she slept in true warmth, bathed in the soft, flickering glow of the fire, the sound of its crackling a companionable presence in the vast, silent room. As the weeks passed, a routine settled over her. Her days were filled with the physical labor of reclamation. She found a way to board up the broken windows, leaving small openings for light. She repaired one of the heavy front doors so that it could be barred from the inside. The bank was slowly transforming from a ruin into a rustic but secure shelter. It was during this period, while clearing the last of the rubble from the president's office, that her attention returned to the vault. Near its base, half buried in plaster dust, her shovel struck something hard. It was a long, heavy crowbar, nearly 4 feet of solid steel, its tip flattened from use. It had been left behind by the frustrated looters. She picked it up, feeling its weight in her hands. She had no interest in treasure, but the sealed room represented an untidy, unresolved element in her orderly world. It was also, she reasoned, a completely secure, dry place. If she could get it open, it would be the perfect place to store firewood and supplies, safe from weather and pests. She began to examine the door, not as a lock to be picked, but as a piece of machinery. The combination dial and the handle were fused with rust, hopeless. But the hinges, massive pins of steel set into interlocking brackets, were merely rusted on the surface. She remembered a lesson from her mother's book, a principle of levers and fulcrums. With the crowbar, she had a lever. She jammed the flattened tip into the small gap at the top of the upper hinge and put her full weight on it. The metal groaned, but it did not move. It was a problem of force and angles, a geometry problem made of iron and stone. The work was grueling, a battle of inches. Day after day, she returned to the vault door, attacking the hinges. She used a heavy chunk of limestone as a hammer, driving the tip of the crowbar deeper into the seam around the upper hinge pin. The rhythmic clang of steel on steel echoed through the empty bank, a lonely percussion marking the passage of time. Her hands became calloused and raw. Her muscles ached with a deep, persistent soreness. But she was stubborn, and the problem fascinated her. She experimented, trying different angles, seeking the point of maximum leverage. She worked until sweat dripped from her brow and her arms trembled with fatigue. Then, on the fourth day of her assault, she felt a subtle shift. A scraping, grinding sound came from within the hinge. She put her weight on the crowbar again, and this time, the upper pin moved, just a fraction of an inch, with a screech of tortured metal. Hope surged through her. For the rest of the day, she worked with renewed determination, hammering and prying, slowly, painstakingly, working the pin upward. Finally, with one last great heave, the pin came free, a thick, rusted cylinder of steel. The top of the massive door sagged forward an inch. The lower hinge now bore all the weight. It was easier. Within an hour she had worked the second pin loose. The great iron door, free from its hinges, leaned precariously against the frame. Using the crowbar as a lever against the floor, she managed to pry it open just enough to slip through the gap. She lit a lantern and stepped inside. The air that greeted her was not the damp, musty smell of a tomb, but the dry, clean scent of old paper and leather. The vault was not a strong room for gold, but a records chamber, a fireproof library. It was small, no more than 8 feet square. 3 of the walls were lined with sturdy wooden shelves, and on those shelves sat rows of thick, leather-bound ledgers, their spines stamped in faded gold leaf. Cattleman's Trust, Halsey. In the center of the room stood a heavy oak desk and a single chair, both covered in a fine layer of dust. The room was a time capsule, perfectly preserved from the day it was sealed. On the desk sat a large black metal strongbox. It was locked. Unlike the vault door, its lock was small and simple. A few sharp blows with the crowbar at the hasp, and the lid sprang open. Eliza lifted it, her heart beating a little faster despite herself. Inside, there was no glint of coin or jewel. The box was filled to the brim with paper, stacks of it, tied neatly with string. She lifted out the first bundle. They were depositors' notes, printed on heavy bond paper, each one recording a name, a date, and an amount, and each bearing the florid signature of Silas Croft. She saw names she recognized: Miller, Carter, Gable. To anyone else, they would have been a collection of worthless receipts from a bankrupt institution, a cruel reminder of all that had been lost. But Eliza, who had spent her life with books and numbers, felt a prickle of curiosity. This was a record, a story waiting to be read. She turned her attention to the ledgers on the shelves. She pulled down the largest one, dated for the year the bank failed. She opened it on the desk, the stiff pages crackling in the silent room. The book was filled with columns of transactions, recorded in a precise, elegant script. It was a meticulous accounting of every dollar that had flowed into and out of the bank. And tucked between the pages, near the very end, was a sealed envelope addressed simply, "To whomever finds this." Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the wax seal. Inside was a letter, several pages long, written in the same neat hand as the ledger entries. It began, "My name is Thomas Ames, and I was the chief clerk of this bank. If you are reading this, it means that my conscience has found a voice, even if I lacked the courage to give it one myself." What followed was a full confession, not of his own guilt, but of his employer's. Silas Croft had not lost the town's money in risky cattle futures, as he had claimed. That story had been a carefully constructed lie. Over the course of 6 months, he had systematically converted every asset: the rancher's savings, the merchant's operating funds, the widow's nest eggs, into untraceable bearer bonds and cash. He had emptied the bank, leaving behind only these worthless paper notes to create a confusing trail. Ames, a quiet man trapped by fear and a misplaced sense of loyalty, had been forced to help, recording the fraudulent transactions. The letter detailed Croft's plan, his destination: a bank in San Francisco, and the false name under which he intended to live. But it was the final paragraph that made Eliza's breath catch in her throat. Ames wrote, "I have recorded the truth of every transaction in this ledger. Every stolen dollar is accounted for. I also studied the bank's territorial charter, a copy of which is in the bottom drawer of this desk. It contains a clause, Article 9, Section 4, which states that in the event of the bank's dissolution, any unclaimed deposits or assets legally revert to the holder of the physical property deed after a period of 1 calendar year." Mr. Croft believed no one would ever look, and that the building would fall to the county for taxes. He was a thorough man, but he was arrogant. He did not account for this. It is a small chance, a strange justice, but it is the only one I can offer the good people of Halsey. I pray God it is enough. Eliza's mind raced, connecting the pieces with the speed of a practiced thinker. The bank had failed well over a year ago. She held the deed. The depositor's notes in the strongbox were the legal claims. The ledger was the irrefutable proof of the theft. The fortune wasn't gone, it was stolen. And according to the law, the claim to it now belonged to her. She sank into the dusty chair, the letter in her hand, the weight of her discovery settling upon her. She looked from the ledger to the strongbox, then at her own calloused hands. Her mother had taught her that literacy was power, that numbers told the truth. In this dusty, forgotten room, that inheritance had just unlocked the future of an entire town. She was no longer just a survivor in a ruin. She was the custodian of a stolen hope, and the quiet girl who had been dismissed and overlooked now held the key to everything. The immediate thrill of discovery quickly gave way to the sobering weight of responsibility. Eliza knew this was bigger than her own fortune. The names in the ledger were not abstractions. They were the people she had known her whole life, the families who had lost everything, whose despair had emptied the streets of Halsey. The money was theirs, stolen from them by an act of profound betrayal. Her holding the deed was a legal accident, a quirk of fate. To simply claim the money for herself felt like a second theft. Her purpose, she realized with absolute clarity, was not to enrich herself, but to restore what had been taken. Yet she was an 18-year-old girl with no standing and no power. Who would believe her? A wild story about a hidden ledger and a legal loophole coming from an orphan squatting in the town's most hated building would be dismissed as fantasy, or worse, as a grift. She needed allies. She needed proof that was not just on paper, but in the testimony of trusted men. Her thoughts turned to Jacob Miller, not the man who had sent her away, but his older cousin, a patriarch of the valley. A man who had built one of the largest ranches in the territory from nothing. He had lost more than anyone in Croft's swindle. He was a hard, quiet man, known for his unyielding integrity. He had refused to leave, and now lived a Spartan existence in a small line shack on the edge of his former lands, a symbol of the town's stubborn, wounded pride. If she could convince Jacob Miller, she could convince anyone. The next morning, she wrapped the main ledger and the bank charter in a piece of oilcloth, took the strongbox with its notes, and set out on the 5-mile walk to Miller's property. She found him splitting wood beside a small, neatly kept cabin, his back still straight and powerful despite his age. His face, weathered and grim, registered surprise at her approach, but he said nothing, simply resting his axe and watching her. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice steady, "I need to ask for your time. I have something to show you. It concerns the cattleman's trust." His eyes narrowed with suspicion and old pain. "There's nothing left to say about that bank, girl. It's dead and buried." Eliza did not flinch. "Not entirely, sir," she said. She unwrapped the heavy ledger and laid it on the woodpile. "I found the bank's final records. They weren't destroyed. Silas Croft didn't lose the money. He stole it, and I have the proof." For an hour she laid out the story, her presentation as clear and logical as one of her mother's geometry proofs. She showed him the clerk's letter, pointed to his own name in the ledger, the record of his life's savings, and then produced the corresponding depositor's note from the strongbox. Finally, she showed him the bank charter, her finger tracing the words of Article 9, Section 4. Jacob Miller listened in silence, his expression unreadable. He picked up his own depositor's note, studying the paper, the ink, the familiar signature of the man who had ruined him. He ran a thumb over the columns in the ledger. He was a man who understood cattle counts and land deeds. He recognized the authority of a well-kept book. When she finished, a long silence stretched between them, broken only by the sighing of the wind. "You can read this," he said at last. It was not a question, but a statement of fact, tinged with a kind of wonder. "Every word," Eliza confirmed. "My mother was a teacher." He looked from the book to her face, and for the first time, he seemed to see her not as a stray orphan, but as someone of substance. "If this is true," he said slowly, his voice raspy with an emotion he could not hide, "if what these papers say is the God's own truth, then everything changes." He straightened up, his eyes seeming to regain a fire she had never seen in them. "We need to gather the others," he declared. "Ben Carter, the blacksmith. He can tell if this ink is fresh. Sarah Gable, she'll remember the dates Croft made her husband sign his papers. We need witnesses. We need a council." In that moment, Jacob Miller became her first and most powerful advocate. Her solitary quest had just become a community's cause. Word traveled with the speed of a prairie fire. Jacob Miller rode out that same day, a man possessed of a renewed and righteous purpose. He sought out the scattered remnants of Halsey's citizenry, the families clinging to their homesteads, the ranchers who had been reduced to hiring themselves out as day laborers. He brought them back to the bank, one by one or in small family groups. They came with suspicion in their eyes, their faces etched with the hardness of loss. They entered the cavernous stone building, a place they had only known as the source of their ruin, and found Eliza Crane waiting for them, a ledger open on a makeshift table. She met each of them with the same calm, quiet dignity. She would find their name in the book, show them the record of their savings, and explain the clerk's letter and the charter. She answered their questions patiently, her command of the facts irrefutable. Ben Carter, the blacksmith, a man whose powerful hands were surprisingly gentle, examined the ledger under the lantern light. "The paper is right for the time," he pronounced, sniffing a page. "And this ink, it's iron gall. Been set on this page for more than a year, I'd wager. This is no forgery." Sarah Gable, a widow whose grief had settled into a fierce, protective shell, gave a tearful but clear account of the day Silas Croft had convinced her husband to sign over the deed to their farm as collateral, a transaction meticulously recorded in the ledger. With each new testimony, the truth became more solid, more undeniable. The atmosphere in the bank began to change. The initial skepticism gave way to a fragile, burgeoning hope, and then to a slow-burning anger directed not at the world, but at the man who had wronged them. The bank's main room, which had been Eliza's solitary refuge, transformed into a town hall, a council chamber, a place of pilgrimage. People started bringing things. Ben Carter arrived one afternoon with his tools, and without a word, set about expertly repairing the cracked stove and forging a new, stronger latch for the front doors. Sarah Gable and two other women organized a communal kitchen in one corner, bringing stew and fresh bread, their presence turning the cold stone building into a place of warmth and nourishment. Men who had been rivals for grazing rights now worked side by side, patching the roof properly, replacing the broken glass in the windows with oiled paper, and building sturdy benches from salvaged lumber. The work was a form of therapy, a way to channel their anger and grief into something constructive. They were not just repairing a building, They were rebuilding the heart of their community, and Eliza, the quiet girl with the book, was its unlikely center. They began to call her Miss Crane, a title of respect offered freely and without prompting. She had given them more than just the possibility of their money back. She had given them back their shared history and a common cause. The reclamation was a slow, legal process, navigated by the steady hand of Jacob Miller and the undeniable evidence of the ledger. He and a small council, elected in the main room of the bank, hired a lawyer from Topeka and filed a formal claim with the territorial government, presenting the ledger, the clerk's letter, and sworn affidavits from a dozen former residents of Halsey. The territorial marshals, armed with the detailed information from Thomas Ames's letter, were able to track Silas Croft to San Francisco, where he was living under an assumed name. They froze his assets, and the slow, arduous process of recovery began. While the lawyers and politicians argued, life in Halsey began to settle into a new rhythm. Some of the families who had left began to drift back, drawn by the news that the town was not as dead as they had believed. The money had not yet returned, but the hope had, and that proved to be a more powerful currency. The bank became the town's official center. By unanimous vote of the council, the deed was formally and legally signed over to Eliza, free and clear, along with a promise of a 10% finder's fee from all recovered assets. It was a fortune that would ensure she would never be homeless or hungry again, but she had already found something more valuable. The community decided that the large banking room should serve a dual purpose. By day, it was to be a schoolhouse. By night, a town hall. And there was no question as to who the teacher would be. Eliza, using her mother's books and her own clear, patient methods, began teaching the town's children their letters and numbers. She would stand before them, a piece of charcoal in her hand, and draw the clean, perfect lines of a triangle on a slate, explaining the principles of Euclid with the same reverence her mother once had. She was a natural teacher, and the children, many of whom had never had any formal schooling, were hungry to learn. The back office, where the vault stood with its door now properly rehinged by the blacksmith, became her private quarters. It was a simple, comfortable home, filled with the warmth of her repaired stove and the scent of the bread Sarah Gable often left for her. She was no longer Eliza Crane, the orphan, the outsider. She was Miss Crane, the teacher, a respected and essential member of the community she had resurrected. She had a name, a home, and a purpose, all of it built from the ruins of a failed bank. One evening, as winter began to lay its first frost on the prairie, Eliza sat in her small apartment, the quiet hum of the town council meeting filtering through her door. The main room was lit by a dozen lanterns, their warm glow a beacon in the vast darkness of the plains. She looked at the simple bookshelf Ben Carter had built for her. On it sat her mother's worn copy of Euclid's Elements, its spine faded, its pages soft with use. Next to it, she had placed the letter written by Thomas Ames, the bank clerk, which she had carefully preserved. One was an inheritance of knowledge, a gift of logic and reason from the mother who had loved her. The other was an inheritance of conscience, a gift of truth from a stranger she would never meet, a man who had chosen to do the right thing in the face of his own fear. She thought of the $10 bill, the last of her mother's money, and the desperate choice she had made. It had bought her a pile of stones, a broken roof, and a future she could never have imagined. Eliza Crane was 18 and had been homeless. She had $10 to her name, and she spent it on a ruin. It was the only true home she had ever known, built not of stone and wood, but of numbers and names, and the quiet, world-changing power of a single well-kept book. It was the best $10 she ever spent.